salted in pieces to the parishioners. Time endears things to people, even things that are not the best taste.
And get our afternoon sessions started pretty much on schedule. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the sound system, and just point out that the only speakers we have in the room are in the front of the room, and we have boosted the volume on the lectern speaker as much as we can. But if you're in the back and having a difficult time hearing, moving closer to the front is the best solution to that problem, just because of the dynamics of the room. Also, there have been some questions about the offering that we received at opening worship last night, and Jim Biegler has some information about that you might find useful.
A couple of people have asked me about how we can make an offering to the National Center for the Healing, the boarding school situation. If you want to give cash without worrying about tax deduction, I have an envelope that I would be happy to receive that, and I will transmit it. Of course, there was the QR code on the back of the leaflet last night, and that's the most direct way to make a contribution. If you would like to write a check, I will be happy to transmit it. You can write it to NWCU 23 if you like, or to the center itself. But we didn't get a basket out to receive contributions last night, and it is indeed a worthy offering if you choose to make it. So if I can facilitate that, I'm happy to do so. Thank you.
Thank you for your willingness to do that, Jim. Questions for our speakers in this session. We're going to ask you to submit questions through the Whova app, and that's because this is one of the sessions that's being live streamed for people who registered in the online track, and we want our online participants to be able to ask questions as well. And Chris Androsky will be moderating the Q&A time. So if you have a question and you're whether you're online or in the room, if you would submit it to Whova, through Whova, we'll get to those questions first. And then if we have time, we can also take some questions in the room. Yes, question?
This doesn't have what can you do about lowering or raising the temperature in this room?
Well, we can look into that. Probably not a lot. You want it warmer or cooler?
I want it warmer.
Warmer, okay.
Cooler.
Should we take a poll? How many people? This may be an example of coming to ecumenical consensus, determining the appropriate rule. And if we probably could get that accomplished in less than 500 years, but maybe not much. Well, let me introduce our fantastic speakers to you. Dynasty Caesar is an agent of change, and she is dedicated to creating pathways for Black liberation in the city of Milwaukee. She started her career in Lindsay Heights as a community organizer at Running Rebels, where she focused primarily on eliminating silos, helping residents define their community, and supported efforts to challenge gentrification and displacement. She then went on to facilitate anti-racism trainings at various organizations and businesses in Milwaukee and Racine with the YWCA Southeast Wisconsin. In her role as the Environmental Sustainability Program Coordinator at the City of Milwaukee, Dynasty focused on creating a more equitable environment for communities of color and developed Climate Change 101 to connect them to the effects of climate change. She also served on the Racial Equity and Inclusion Leadership Team of the City of Milwaukee as a policy committee chair. Dynasty has also developed curriculum for Marquette's 414 Fellows Program, as well as facilitated several discussions about organizing community leadership and racism. She has also been a volunteer member of the advisory committee of the City of Milwaukee's Fond du Lac and North Avenue Comprehensive Plan, as well as the organizing chair for Black Youth Project 100's Milwaukee chapter. Dynasty currently serves as the Stewardship Committee co-chair of the Milwaukee Community Land Trust Board. Dynasty will continue to strive for a more equitable Milwaukee as she works to desegregate housing in her role as the senior organizer for the redress movement. Our other presenter is Mr. Reggie Jackson. He is an award-winning journalist, a graduate of Concordia University, co-owner of Nurturing Diversity Partners, and 2021 winner of the Carter G. Woodson Memorial Award from the National Education Association. 2015 winner of the Eliminating Racism Award from Southeast Wisconsin's YWCA, and 2016 Courageous Love Award from the First Unitarian Society. He's the 2017 winner of the Frank P. Zeidler Public Service Award from the City of Milwaukee. He won the first ever Micah Legacy Award in 2018. He and his business partner, Dr. Fran Kaplan, were awarded the Robert H. Freebert Social Justice Award from the Jewish Community Relations Council in 2018. In August 2016, he accepted a position as Community Relations Writer for the Milwaukee Independent. He was invited to be a contributing writer for the Huffington Post. In October 2017, his column at the Milwaukee Independent won the 2017 Silver Award for Best Online Column and 2018 Gold Award for Best Online Column. He's also won a Bronze Award for Best Investigative Story or Series from the Milwaukee Press Club. He's the 2019 winner of the Frank P. Zeidler Legacy Award from the Frank Zeidler Center for Public Discussion. Reggie's firm, Nurturing Diversity Partners, was a recipient of the first ever Milwaukee Magazine Unity Award in 2020. His 2020 podcast, By Every Measure, with Tariq Moody at 889 Radio Station, won the 2020 Golden Award for Best Podcast from the Milwaukee Press Club. Reggie has served as a race relations expert for ABC News Nightline, CNN, Wisconsin Public Radio, National Public Radio, Reuters News Service, the BBC, and several statewide news channels and multiple additional international news platforms. As you can tell, our speakers are very qualified to help us learn this afternoon about some of the legacy of systemic racial issues in Milwaukee, particularly how they impact housing in this community. So we are very privileged to have you with us this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to begin by just letting you know I had a stroke 6 months ago, so I'm very blessed to be here with you today. And my recovery is going really well. Thank you. The only thing that hasn't recovered as well as I want is my voice. My voice is usually much stronger than this, so my voice is a little bit weaker than I'm accustomed to. I usually have a booming voice, not very right, but I usually have a very strong voice, and it's a little bit weaker than I'm accustomed to. So I apologize if you have a little trouble understanding me today, but I'm really feel very fortunate to be here with you and feeling healthy and strong, and great to be here with my colleague Dynasty. You know, we both work with a national organization called the Redress Movement, which we'll talk about in a moment. But this work, talking about segregation, is something that's very dear to my heart. I was born in a little segregated town in Mississippi back in 1965. The day that I was born, my mother and I had to go through the back door of the hospital because that was just the policy at that particular time. And I left Mississippi, moved to Milwaukee when I was 7 years old back in 1973. Didn't know that Milwaukee was a very, very segregated, community until, I was in my 20s before I even realized it. So I always tell people that I went from Jim Crow South to Jim Crow North during my life journey. And so I started to study segregation many years ago. And I've been doing some version of the presentation I'm going to do with you all today for about the last 7 years. And I started to look at segregation as it impacted Milwaukee because I started to get tired of hearing that Milwaukee was the most segregated city in the country, which it isn't, by the way. It never has been because they generally don't measure segregation by cities, they measure by metropolitan statistical areas. In Milwaukee, they do a measure every 10 years when the census comes out. In the last census, Milwaukee actually moved from #1 to #2. So we're no longer the most segregated community in the country, we're actually the second most segregated. New Jersey passed us up with the last census. So I'm gonna go over kind of the history of segregation, how it developed. There's a lot of things that people think they know about how segregation developed, which really isn't true. And one of the things that stands out in my mind as I study segregation and how people talk about it is something that Dr. King said many years ago. He said that Sunday is the most segregated day of the week in the United States. And you know, I've been saying to people for many years that when we think about segregation, it's more than about where we live, it's about where we work, or where we play, where we shop, where we worship, are all in very segregated spaces, right? So we live in these little segregated bubbles our entire lives without really understanding how that impacts our inability to get to know people from outside of those bubbles we live in. It makes it very difficult for us to have conversations and to have really productive communication across, divides because we don't spend time with people from other groups. We don't get to know them very well, and we interact with them based on what we think we know about the group they belong to, right? And so oftentimes those stereotypical views we have of people, and it makes it really difficult to have a decent conversation with people because people have different perspectives. I've always said to people that, listen, all of us are a product of our lived experiences, and the way that we see the world is directly related to the environment that we grew up in, So people from different backgrounds, different places can have a great conversation. We've been taught to think that we're so divided that we can't, but listen, I've traveled around the state of Wisconsin. I've been in 50 different communities having conversations with people about race and racism. Even though my friends told me when I started doing this work, Reggie, you can't go to different parts of Wisconsin talking about race and racism. They don't want to get right around the town, Reggie. You don't need a bodyguard. And I've been welcomed with 50 communities around the state. Lloyd, James, Robertson, Burlington, Platteville, Whitewater, Appleton, Green Bay, La Crosse. I've been just all over the place. I visited a place I never thought I would ever see in my life. Because growing up in Milwaukee is a little out for any other part of the state. We saw Milwaukee. I never saw even the suburbs of Milwaukee. I never really saw as a kid. But I've learned over the course of time that the segregation that I see that's so prevalent here in Milwaukee was created intentionally. It didn't happen by accident. There was an intentionality behind it. A lot of different entities played a role in it. I'm going to talk about some of those today. And I think that it's done us as a nation a disservice because what it does is it makes it really, really hard for us to interact with people from different places than the places that we live in. And I want to change that. That's part of the work that we're doing with the Redress Movement. The Redress Movement is a national organization that came under the work of author Richard Rothstein's first book, The Coloring Law, which talked about the role that the local, state, and federal governments played in creating segregated spaces. And so out of those conversations that people had after doing book clubs for Richard's book, a movement started to begin to address the damage caused by segregation policies and practices that took place over decade after decade. And so we're working with the Redress Dynasty IR. And this is our website. Dynasty is the local field organizer here in Milwaukee. I'm part of the national research team, and we're working really, really hard to change things here in Metro Milwaukee. We know that we're a very segregated community, but there are things that can be done to shift that narrative, to make it so that even if we remain very, very segregated residentially, it doesn't mean we have to remain segregated up here in our brains. And I've always believed that you can change laws, but you can't legislate morality. And even if you change laws, some groundbreaking laws back in the 60s changed a lot of things, but that didn't mean that everybody's attitudes necessarily changed. A lot of old attitudes that were prevalent are still prevalent to this day. And so Part of what we're trying to do with the redress movement is to bring a coalition, multi-generational, multi-racial, and ethnic group of people together to have conversations about what they can do collaboratively, the work that they can do collaboratively. And we've been very successful doing this work. It was launched in 3 cities to begin with: Charlotte, North Carolina, Denver, Colorado, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The first 3 cities we're working in, but we're branching out to have conversations with people in other cities as well to do this work. And we're very, very happy. Dynasty and I are, well, I can speak for me. I'm going to let Dynasty speak for herself about, the gratitude that I get out of doing the work with redress is just phenomenal for me.
Yes, so for me, I am the senior campaign organizer for the redress movement. Our work is centered primarily on doing work for Milwaukee, city of Milwaukee. But we have found that when we talk about segregation, we can't focus primarily on one area because we don't want for people just in Milwaukee to feel like segregation is gone. They should feel that same way to Madison or other parts of the state, even the country, which is why we have other field organizers in other states. But our work right now is focused primarily on encouraging the County Board of Supervisors to implement a housing subcommittee. I will speak more to that later on, but I want to make sure Reggie can get into the good stuff for you all.
Thanks, Dynasty. So I'm going to begin by going back to the original slide. That map that you see there, that was a map drawn by the federal government back in 1938. Most people see those maps and they call them redlining maps. That's not what they would call them. The federal government called them residential security maps. They were drawn by an organization called the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 239 cities around the country. And they played a really big role in not creating segregation, because segregation already existed, but maintaining segregation, because the federal government eventually started to use maps. Either these maps or maps that they drew very similar to these in terms of helping people to become homeowners or preventing people from becoming homeowners. I'm going to show you a video a little bit later in the presentation to talk more about those maps and the impact that they had and describe what the colors mean and the grades that they got. But this is what's called the racial dot map of Metro Milwaukee. So the metropolitan statistical area of Milwaukee includes all 19 communities within Milwaukee County, all the communities within Waukesha, Milwaukee, and Washington County, which are exurban counties. And the orange dots there represent where white people live, the green dots represent where blacks live, and the blue dots where Hispanics live, and there's dots for other groups, but they're such small numbers that you can barely see them. But it's very clear to see how segregated the city of Milwaukee is within that kind of red border. The north side of the city of Milwaukee is where a majority of black people here live, the north and northwest side. Most of the Hispanics live on the south side. And that's part of the reason Milwaukee is considered one of the most segregated communities. Segregation is measured by looking at a metropolitan statistical area and comparing people of color and where they live to where whites live. And if they are, together, bunched together like they are here, then that segregation measure will be really, really high. If they're more spread out, then the segregation measure will be low. What people generally don't know is that the Midwest is the most segregated part of the United States of America by far. It's not the South. The South is the most integrated part of the United States, in fact. The Midwest is the most segregated part. And so when you look at a list of the 10 most segregated communities, you'll see places like Milwaukee, Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, places like that are generally in the top 10 of the most segregated communities in the country. And there's reason behind that. Part of it was a reaction to the Great Migration of blacks leaving the South from 1910 to 1970. 6 million black people fled the Jim Crow South, and they moved to the Midwest, they moved to the East Coast, they moved to the West Coast. Anywhere other than the South, they just wanted to get away from those places. And white people did not react very well to these black people moving to their communities. They started working immediately to make sure that those people wouldn't live next to them. And that's why these places became very, very segregated. So I'm going to show you the demographics from the latest census data. Milwaukee is the most demographically diverse community in the entire state of Wisconsin. 85% of the residents of Wisconsin are white. Only 6.1% are black. But 61% of all black people who live in the state of Wisconsin live in the city of Milwaukee. And that's like really, really strange to think about. Once you leave Milwaukee and travel other parts of the state, you don't see many people of color, particularly not blacks. You'll see Asians and Hispanics in different places, but you don't see black people really outside of Metro Milwaukee area very much. So that's what the city looks like. Now, Hispanic whites, 32%, blacks, about 38%, Asians, 5.2%. Latino, which is not a racial group, that's an ethnicity. So you can be of any race and be Latino. 20% of the population, and the Native Americans are a little bit less than 1/2 or 1%. But when we leave the city and go out to our suburbs, they look quite a bit different than what the city looks like. That's the suburban demographics. So those 18 cities that wrap around Milwaukee, doesn't look much like the city, right? As you can see, it's a huge difference there. And when you extend that out to the exurban counties, what we call here locally the wild counties, Waukesha, Ozark, and Washington County, you'll see an even more drastic difference. That's what Waukesha County looks like, and that 1.6% includes my daughter. I don't know why she lives in Waukesha, but she hates it. And this is Ozark County, and the whitest of them all is Washington County. 91% of the residents there are white. And so what you have is a very diverse city surrounded by communities that have little to no racial diversity. But what makes Milwaukee different than Chicago or Detroit or Buffalo or Cleveland is that Milwaukee has by far the whitest suburbs in the country. So when you look at people who live in these particular counties and the percentage of the people in those counties that live outside the central city. So Milwaukee County, only 10.1% of all black people who live in Milwaukee County live outside the city of Milwaukee. And if you go to Erie County, where Buffalo is, 24% of blacks in Erie County don't live in the city of Buffalo. 26% of black people in Wayne County don't live in Detroit. That includes my father, who lives in suburbs of Detroit. In Cook County, 34% of blacks in Cook County don't live in the city of Chicago. And 51% of blacks in Cuyahoga County don't live in the city of Cleveland. So Milwaukee suburbs look way different than the suburbs in these other highly segregated places. All of these places are in the top 10 list of most segregated metropolitan areas in the country, but you can see Milwaukee stands out. Milwaukee's an outlier when it comes to that. That's what's different about Milwaukee versus the other highly segregated places. Those suburbs look way different. And one of the foremost experts on history of segregation, historian Arnold Hirsch, wrote years ago that the conscious deliberate choice of segregation lay at the heart of national policy. And these two images you see, the one that says entering Wauwatosa, City of Homes, restricted zoning, that was a sign that was out in Wauwatosa, all over Wauwatosa for many, many years. And what it let people know is that there was restricted zoning, which meant that there were racially restricted covenants that prevented people from living in certain places within Wauwatosa. And that sign was all over the place. There was one just like it in City Hall until about 5 years ago. They finally removed it. In that book that you see there, Washington Highlands, that was a book that was created by the Washington Highlands Neighborhood Association, and it listed what they call restrictions and protections. And one of the earliest racial restricted covenants ever written in Metro Milwaukee was written there in Washington Highlands subdivision, which basically said only white people can live in that subdivision.
And this is where we first see this racial language.
Caucasians only, Aryans only, no Negroes or no members of African blood or descent.
100% of them were native black people.
In many ways, racial covenants, this is kind of ground zero of residential segregation. In the United States, and racism has a very, very long history, but this particular deployment of racism is fairly new, and this idea was really made material through instruments like racial covenants.
The law of the streets, the law of the courts working in consort to discourage blacks from moving into white neighborhoods.
It starts out as private property developers, but eventually you have the federal government encouraging these racial covenants, demanding actually that any investment they make is protected with this kind of racial exclusivity.
When you can covenant entire areas of the city, it makes it off limits, that's pretty powerful.
The Supreme Court even held that restrictive covenants were constitutional. This was in the case of Corrigan v. Buckley, and it was in that decision where the court resolved that restrictive covenants are contracts, and as such, they are lawful. Now forget about the fact that they discriminate, and forget about the fact that once we say these contracts exist, we are bringing up a violation issue of the 14th Amendment. Forget about that. The key thing is that the Supreme Court validated segregation, validated discrimination.
You have the full force of the law, the court system determining who could go where.
And what will happen as a result of that is you'll see efforts to ensure that a denial to one of the most basic foundations of opportunity for African Americans will be codified in the United States as a result.
You had not only the courts supporting it, but also a kind of license of sorts of people going to the streets and harassing blacks who moved into white neighborhoods.
And this is where the term redlining comes into place. The FHA, they made color-coded maps of all the largest cities in the United States, and they broke cities down into 4 different areas. Red is considered hazardous, that's the worst. Yellow is considered definitely declining, blue is considered still desirable, and green is considered the best.
And what's so powerful about this kind of scale of measuring investment, it was about values and people.
The fact of the matter is that there was no evidence that those people who lived in those communities, predominantly black and brown people and foreign-born people, would have defaulted on loans.
The FHA is being very upfront and very explicit in how they are linking spatial desirability with racial occupancy. It's this racialization of space idea. So areas that were predominantly African American or majority minority, or really in a lot of cases, even if there's a few non-white people there, that's often enough to be redlined. So when they built these maps, they also explain why each area got the ranking it did. There's one part of South Minneapolis was redlined specifically due to, and I'm quoting, a gradual infiltration of Negroes and Asiatics. The FHA refused to give an area a green line designation. Again, this is the best designation that they'll offer unless, and I'm quoting again, restrictive covenants are already in place. That lies from the FHA underwriting manual. Racial covenants aren't just about discriminating against people of color. It's about enriching white people. And I think that's the part that often gets lost in this narrative.
In a lot of ways, the practice of redlining, which didn't start until the 1930s, institutionalized and spread racial covenants all over the country because suddenly developers got sanctioned, they got direction from the federal government saying, this is best practices if you want to have a really high rating from us, if you want to get the most favorable terms for any loans.
So if somebody sells a covenanted home to an African American, the neighbors can sue that person because their property values are now lower. If I have a covenanted home and I sell it to somebody who isn't white and I get sued, I lose the house. Any equity that I've accumulated, the property reverts to the initial granting party. So whoever first put that covenant on the land. If that person's dead, I would revert to that, the heirs or assigns of the initial covenanting party. So the risk of going against these things is just like astronomical.
That video is just a small piece of an award-winning video called Jim Crow and More, produced by Minnesota Twin Cities Public Television. You can find it on, you Google it, or go to YouTube, you can find the full video. And there's a lot more details. That group of people that you saw in the video are from a project called the Mapping Prejudice Project, where they were attempting to map where every single racial restricted covenant in Hennepin County, Minnesota was. They finished their project, and now they're actually working with the group here in Milwaukee, where we're attempting to map where all the racial covenants in Milwaukee work. And I'll talk about that shortly. So, this is the area D5 on the 1938 map of Milwaukee. In that area, bounded by North Avenue to North Juneau to the south, 3rd Street to the east, and 12th Street to the west, is literally where almost every black person in Milwaukee lived. To live outside of the borders in that area was practically impossible. It didn't matter how much money you had. if you were black, you were going to be stuck in that area. And so, what people don't know about the maps is each map came with descriptions of why the areas got the rating that they got. And at the bottom of the page for this particular area, D5, they described it as a Negro and slum area in Milwaukee. They said it is old and very ragged. And besides the colored people, a large number of lower type Jews are moving into this section. The section housed Milwaukee's wealthiest family 70 years ago. So normally what happens once the area is red on that map, what that means is that you cannot get insurance for a home. Whether it's a residence or property or a business property, nobody will insure it, which means the bank will not give you a loan. If you can't get insurance, they're not going to give you a loan, which means that it's practically impossible to get a home and begin home ownership, which is, part of the American dream, right? So when we talk about those racial restricted covenants, and I'll show an example of one shortly, there was a group in the late 70s that attempted to figure out where these covenants were written in the Milwaukee County suburbs, and what they found in that report that they wrote in 1979 was that subdivisions established in 1927 in Cudahy Shore, West Milwaukee, Rifles Bay, and Wauwatosa excluded all non-Caucasian families in the language of the covenants they wrote. In the 1930s, they found subdivisions in Bayside, 5 Point, Glendale, Greenfield, Hills Corners, St. Francis, South Milwaukee, categorically excluded black people. In the 1940s, Brown Deer, Franklin, Glendale, Hills Corners, St. Francis, West Allis were still using covenants to exclude blacks from newly created subdivisions, even as late as 1958. 10 years after the U.S. Supreme Court said you can't enforce these covenants anymore, people were still writing them here in Metro Milwaukee, and Glendale in particular. And many of these had extension dates far into the future. So it may have been written in, say, 1915 or 1919, but the expiration date of that was, say, 1960 or 1970, whichever date they chose. And with many of these, they had an automatic extension once they expired. Nobody had to do anything. It just automatically kicked in a 10-year extension, 20-year extension, whatever they wrote into it when they wrote these. And these were legally binding on whoever owned that property. Didn't matter. It ran with the land, as they called it. So if you had it and you sold it to another family, they had to abide by the terms of that racial covenant. And so here is some information about the Mapping Racism and Resistance Project. So I wear a lot of hats. This is one of the other hats I wear. Working with this group, we're attempting to map all of the racial covenants. Now we know from the computer helping us do some of the work that we're going to find somewhere between 20 and 25,000 racial restricted covenants in Milwaukee County. 20 to 25,000. We've already mapped about 2,000 of those so far, and the group hopes to be done with the mapping by the end of this year. And it'll be available for the public to see exactly what neighborhoods the covenants were in. And I know from the early part of the first 2,000 or so that they mapped, they're very close to the home that my wife and I own in Milwaukee, right along Townsend Boulevard, right off of Fond du Lac. There were a ton of these racial covenants over that area, and that's the area where we live right now. And so I did check our house to see if there was a covenant attached to our property. There wasn't, but neighbor across the street. So on one side of the street, there were no covenants. On the opposite side of the street, that entire block was covenanted. So all of those homes would have been off limits to us back in really through 1970. This is an example of one of those covenants. Now, when I say this was intentional, people were not ashamed of this. They were very proud of what they were doing, and they didn't care if anybody was bothered by it. They were very explicit in the language that they used. This one was written in 1937 in South Milwaukee. And look at the expiration date, January 1st, 2024. Now, had the federal government not created the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968, these things would still be legally binding, but they're unconstitutional. But these folks were thinking way ahead. They wanted that community to be all white through at least January 1st, 2024. And so once I was doing a presentation, Mayor of South Milwaukee was there. He saw this. He's like, Reggie, what can we do? How can I get rid of it? I'm like, Mr. Mayor, don't get rid of it. I said, use it as a teachable moment to show why South Milwaukee is like 92% white. It's because of stuff like this. Don't try to get rid of this part of the historical record. Don't erase the history. Keep it. But understand that this is part of why your community looks the way it looks. And This was similar language, kind of boilerplate language. And in fact, the Federal Housing Administration gave people a template to use if they didn't know how to write these. And this is similar language they use. At no time should any such lot or any building be purchased, owned, leased, occupied, or used by any person other than citizens of the United States of America of the white race. This provision shall not apply to domestic servants which may be employed by the owner or occupant of any such lot or building thereon. And what's important about this is that it's not just about who can purchase it, lease it. It's really about who can occupy the space. So those domestic workers could only legally occupy that space during their working hours. When their working hours are over, they can no longer legally occupy that space. Imagine that. That's how powerful these things were, and they were legally binding. If your neighbors didn't like you and they called you on it, you would lose your home and all the equity you built. You would lose that property permanently. The National Association of Real Estate Boards actually helped to normalize segregation with a policy that people refer to as steering, which is illegal, but it's still going on a daily basis around the country. Part of what we're discovering with our research with the redress movement is that the steering is still pretty normal in a lot of communities around the country. And what it is people who want to buy a home, they go looking for a place to buy a home, and they get steered to certain neighborhoods, racially homogenous neighborhoods. For instance, there's a friend of mine who works at Marquette University, moved to Milwaukee about 15 years ago from out of state. He didn't know anything about Milwaukee. He was looking for a place to buy a home. He found the perfect home, well maintained. One family had owned the home, and they just did a phenomenal job of keeping the house up. It was right in his price range. He loved the neighborhood, and he was going to buy that house, but his realtor was like, "You don't want to buy that house." He's like, "I do want to buy this house. It's perfect. It fits everything I'm looking for." And the realtor was like, "No, you don't want to move in that neighborhood. You want to buy a house somewhere else." And so eventually he did. He bought a house in Hill's Corners. But he didn't know that the realtor was steering him out of a black neighborhood into a white neighborhood. He had no idea. He found out once he talked to me, though. And I was like, "Dude, that's steering. That's against the law." You could have sued him for doing that because it's against federal law. So they made it so that if you're a real estate agent, you should never be instrumental in introducing to a neighborhood a character, property occupants, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in the neighborhood. Now, they knew that statement was not correct, that people of those groups moving in did not lower property values. In fact, they actually made property values go up. This is what happens. They used a policy where they would scare people, white people, into selling their homes very cheaply. They would come in, and it's called blockbusting. They would say, "Listen, you know those people are coming. You better sell your house before the property values go down." So these people are now going to be desperate to sell their homes, and you have speculators that come in and buy their home for half of what it's worth because the people are in a rush to get out before the property values go down. And now black people, Hispanic people, Jewish families, immigrants are going to come in because they're stuck and they want to advance out of the neighborhoods they're in. They're going to come in, they're desperate too. So you have desperate people trying to get out. You have another group of desperate people trying to get in. And so these speculators will convince people, okay, go ahead and sell your house. They'll buy your house for half of what it's worth, and then they'll turn around and sell it to those black families for 3-4 times what that property is actually worth. And the black people are so desperate that they don't have a choice, they're going to pay it. And so initially the property values go up, but what ends up happening is that those families that are moving in, those neighborhoods become overcrowded. Oftentimes what they're paying for the home is too expensive for them. So now you have to double up and have 2 families living in the house, or maybe 3 families moving in the house. And eventually, you can't maintain the property, and that's when the property values go down, but initially they go up instead of down. But that was part of the code of ethics that every realtor had to abide by for 30 some odd years. And when they did change it, they didn't really fix it. They took that language out after 1950, and then they started using some language that was very similar to that. We're talking about other groups. They use the words other groups, will be detrimental to property values. So they knew that language was very racist, so they cleaned it up by just saying, other groups, instead of being very specific. So over the course of time, I heard earlier, one of the presenters was talking about, the American dream. Well, the American dream wasn't always the American dream. To become homeowners became normalized in the 1930s when the federal government stepped in and started offering people different types of loans, amortized mortgage. Prior to the 1930s, if you wanted to become a homeowner, you typically had 3 to 5 years to pay off your house. Imagine that. Your down payment was going to be 50 to 75%, and your interest rate was going to be really, really high. And so the federal government knew that there was a foreclosure crisis in the early 1930s, and they stepped in and created the Federal Housing Administration and started giving new mortgages, amortized mortgages, gave people up to 20 years to pay off their houses, lowered the interest rates down tremendously, and cut the down payment to no more than 20%. And that's when homeownership became normal. But they discriminated because they started to fund, home ownership across the country, but they made sure it was primarily for white people. They very intentionally left people of color out, particularly black people around the country, were left out of getting these new homes. And so, even though they underwrote $120 billion in new housing, they very specifically told financial institutions, banks, credit unions, and other lenders to not lend to households, and that should say to not lend to, I was supposed to correct it, and I forgot to correct it, my stroke, sorry. My brain is still not working perfectly yet. But they instruct financial institutions to not lend to households in integrated predominantly African American areas. And guess what? That's exactly what they did. They refused to lend to those communities. And so over 98% of all FHA loans across the country from 1930 to 1950 went to white families only. And so people of color were left out of home ownership, left out of that idea of building the American dream, building family generational wealth, very intentionally. And, we all heard about how wonderful the GI Bill was, right? The GIs came back, let's celebrate the GIs, let's give them an opportunity to get a home loan, free college, all of those wonderful things. But it didn't work the same for the black GIs that it did for white GIs because 19 states maintain separate colleges and universities for black students. How many people know how many states broke away from the Confederate States of America? Anybody know the number of states?
51.
51.
12, 13 of them.
11. And for a bonus, if you can name all 11, I'll give you, I'm not going to give you anything other than that. But 11 states broke away from the Confederacy, right? But they were not the only states that were discriminating against black people. People in the North love to talk about how bad those states in the South were, Mississippi and Alabama, those other states, Georgia, Texas, Florida, whatever, right? And they refused to acknowledge that they had policies. Jim Crow wasn't just in the South, it was in the North as well. And they didn't have, the signs, but they had the same policies and practices in place. And so when black people wanted to come back from the war and take advantage of the GI Bill to go to college, there were only a little over 100 historically black colleges and universities that they had an opportunity to go to. And most of those were very small. Many of them didn't even offer a bachelor's degree program. Only a handful of them offered a master's degree program. And there were just a very small few of them that offered even more advanced degrees. And most of them were so small they didn't have housing to house all the GIs who wanted to go. And so only about 5% of all black GIs within 2 years of coming back from World War II were able to take advantage of GI Bill to go to college. And then because of the redlining practices, they couldn't get the VA guaranteed home loan either. The white GIs did, and that led to this groundswell of home ownership being a norm across the country for white people. Because what happens is you come back from the war and you're able to go to college, get an advanced degree, technical degree, whatever, and also you're able to get a business loan. So I tell people all the time, when you look and you see these vans driving down the street for a plumbing company, ABC Plumbing, right? And they'll say, we've been around since 1952. That's guaranteed to be owned by a white family. Because if it says, X, Y, and Z Plumbing, we've been around since 1982, that's probably owned by a black family because whites came back from the war and they took advantage of business loans and started little businesses that are still in those families years and years later. So the generational wealth was built not only through home ownership, it was also built through business ownership as well. And people getting advanced degrees, becoming architects and dentists, attorneys, all of those things. And that was all part of the GI Bill working in a very discriminatory way. It wasn't written that way. It was written with very colorblind language. But what happens, the federal government gave control of the GI Bill and how it was implemented to the states. So if you think that the state of Mississippi the great state of Mississippi. I always say great because I was born there. There's nothing else great about it, in my opinion. But my mother had 3 uncles who served in World War II. And when they came back, they couldn't take advantage of the GI Bill to get a home or a business loan. They wouldn't give them either. In fact, those uncles weren't able to purchase a home and get a loan until almost 1970. And even though they served in World War II, which ended in 1945. So those things that we take for granted that these things work the same for everybody, it didn't. So 1950 census is a very, very interesting census. There's a very small supplement to it, which showed active mortgages that were around the country, right? And so I looked at that data, and I wanted specifically to look at how it worked in Milwaukee. So in Milwaukee, there were almost 28,000 active mortgages, traditional bank mortgages, and of those, 98.7% were for whites, and only 1.3% were held by blacks. Now, nationally, that number for traditional mortgages was about 96% of traditional mortgages around the country in 1958 were held by whites only. And for the FHA mortgages, about 97% nationally were held by whites only. But in Milwaukee, all of them, all 5,076 were held by whites only. And for the VA mortgages, 3,028 in Milwaukee, all of them were held by white people. Nationally, about 97% of VA loans in 1950 were held by white people. So very discriminatory mortgages made it really, really difficult for people of color to gain access to the American dream, home ownership, generational wealth building. And when we talk about the wealth gap, you hear people say a lot about the wealth gap. The wealth gap is primarily due to a lack of access to home ownership for decades and being able to pass it down to your children and grandchildren. And also having, when you were able to buy a home back in 1950, very cheap home that you can pay 1/3 of what you're paying for rent, you can now buy a brand spanking new home, in a nice, pretty suburb that they built specifically for white people so they could get away from central cities. They built the highway to get you out to the city, to those suburban cities. They built the electrical grid, everything that you need, and now you have access to that. And guess what? Now you're not paying as much money for rent because now you're a homeowner, you have a small mortgage, and you have disposable income. What do you do with that disposable income? You invest in the stock market, you invest in gold, you invest in other things. So you build a generational wealth in that way as well. And people of color, particularly blacks, are left out of that wealth building. So Milwaukee, despite those things, built a thriving business district on Walnut Street called Bronzeville. And that's a picture of Bronzeville in 1953. Now, I heard for many years, and you probably heard this too, anybody in Milwaukee has heard, but the freeway came and destroyed, the business district on Walnut Street. And I believe that for, most of my life, because that's what I heard people say. And when I started to investigate, I realized it wasn't the freeway that did it. In fact, it was a policy called urban renewal, which black people refer to as urban removal, that destroyed Walnut Street. The freeway construction came and destroyed what was left. But this is an aerial photo from 1963. And the red area that's shaded there was that area D5 I showed you earlier. And the green boxes show you two of the earliest urban renewal programs in Milwaukee. So right where the Bronzeville Business District was on Walnut Street, all of those businesses were destroyed in one fell swoop by the Hillside Urban Renewal Project. Almost half of all black businesses in Milwaukee were destroyed by the Urban Renewal Project, and 100 residents displaced, most of them black. And does anybody see a freeway in that picture? Raise your hand if you see a freeway. Freeway. Anybody see a freeway? Okay, I don't have my glasses today, but I know there's no freeway there. But I made this slide. This is 4 years later. You see the pathway of the freeway. Everything was already gone on Walnut Street before the freeway got there. So it wasn't a freeway. Now, Milwaukee started to build freeways in the 1950s through the 1960s, tore down over 14,000 homes. 50% of people displaced by freeway construction were black, even though the black percentage of Milwaukee's population was very, very small in the 50s and 60s. And so what ends up happening, one of these freeways was designed but never built, called the Park West Freeway. You guys remember the ugly freeway that was not far from here called the Park East Freeway that they tore down about 10 years ago. It's right by the fire service forum right now. That freeway, they were going to build an extension to it called Park West Freeway. So they go up Fond du Lac Avenue, turn east at North Avenue, and go all the way over to Sherman Boulevard and connect with another freeway. Well, they tore down 1,500 homes to build it, and they never built the freeway because the community didn't want the freeway. But what you see is that image of where they tore homes down, and most of that is between North Avenue and Milwaukee. Now, what's interesting about that photograph is that was the late 60s when they tore those homes down. I looked at aerial photographs in the early 70s, mid 70s, early 80s, and it still looked exactly the same. They tore down those 1,500 homes, they never rebuilt them. They eventually rezoned that area to commercial, so you couldn't build homes there if you wanted to. But, you know, this is part of the pattern of disinvestment, because when we're talking about segregation in Milwaukee, injustice, racial injustice, a lot of it is due to disinvestment. So they disinvested in those neighborhoods. And the other photograph you see there is where they dug up all this dirt to build Interstate 43. They called it the North-South Freeway at the time. And does anybody know where that dirt went that they dug up out of the ground? It's still here. It's something that's being used almost every day of the year by somebody in Milwaukee. The dirt that they dug up out of the ground to build Interstate 43, they put it in dump trucks, and the dump trucks went down to Lake Michigan, and they built Veterans Park using the dirt from the freeway for I-43. So it's still here. Urban renewal projects around the country destroyed Black and brown neighborhoods. 90% of the homes were never replaced. Even though they promised to replace those homes, they just lied. They never did it. And 2/3 of the people displaced nationwide were Black or Latino. And as you see, 2,500 neighborhoods that were destroyed by urban renewal in almost 1,000 cities. 64% of those neighborhoods destroyed were Black neighborhoods. That's why Black people were calling it urban removal, not urban renewal, because they were the people being removed and displaced. So the other thing that impacted segregation in Milwaukee is that Black people came to Milwaukee in the latter stages of the Great Migration. They didn't come in 1910, 1920, 1930. Milwaukee was not a welcoming place for Black people. You know, the factories wouldn't hire you. But eventually in the 1940s, during World War II, the factories needed labor. They started actively recruiting Black people to come to Milwaukee to work in the factories. And the Black population grew exponentially. So it grew from, you know, about 9,000 people who were Black in 1940. By 1960, it was 62,000 Blacks, 105,000 by 1970, and 200,000 by 1980. And Black people didn't come to Milwaukee because it's a beautiful city on a beautiful lake. They came because there were good jobs here, family supporting wage jobs, as compared to the jobs they had in the South. And so those jobs started to go away. Deindustrialization happened in a lot of Rust Belt cities: Pittsburgh, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Detroit, you know, Flint, Michigan, Chicago, a lot of places, St. Louis. But it really impacted the Black community much more so because the Black community depended on those jobs more than anybody else. So Milwaukee lost 94,000 manufacturing jobs from 1963 to 2019. We're down to less than 25,000 manufacturing jobs currently. And those were the good jobs. Those were the family supporting wage jobs. Didn't require any education. You learned on the job. You could go and quit at one factory and walk down the street and get hired at another factory the same day. These were jobs that allowed you to purchase a home, have a nice car, go on vacations, buy a little cabin up north to go, you know, fishing and hiking with your family. All of the parts of the American dream. Those jobs, those were good jobs. Union jobs that paid good money. But we lost those jobs. And 53,000 of those were lost since the recession 1981 through 82. And they've been replaced by service sector jobs. These were the top employers in Metro Milwaukee in 1970. And as you can see, most of them are gone. Alice Chalmers is gone. A.L. Smith is gone. Briggs and Stratton, pretty much I can say Briggs and Stratton is gone now. I just read an article about them a few months ago that they're going to be closing on what's left of Briggs and Stratton. So they're going to be, I'll be updating that slide to show that they're pretty much gone too. Allen Bradley, Rockwell Automation, way smaller than it used to be. EC Electronics gone. Hermanschwiger is pretty much almost gone. They're going to be down to about 250 employees by the end of this summer. At Komatsu, American Motors. My father-in-law worked for American Motors for 35 years and retired at the age of 55 from American Motors. They're gone. Schlitz and Pabst both closed and stopped making beer in Grove City. And then Millburn, much smaller, as part of most cores than it used to be. So in the good old days, as I call them, black people were doing really well in Milwaukee in 1970. Seventh highest income for blacks in the country. The equivalent would be almost $50,000 in today's money versus just $30,000 median family income for blacks in the city of Milwaukee today. That's a huge difference, huge difference. That's the shift that took place that nobody pays attention to. They just act like, well, black people just got lazy. They stopped working. They didn't want to work hard anymore. And that's why their incomes are so low. No, the jobs are on the way. What could they do? Black people, they own those companies that went out of business. They came to Milwaukee for the jobs, and the jobs disappeared. And they were stuck, oh, now you got to work at Walmart or, Burger King, McDonald's, some service sector job, which pays you next to nothing. Anybody know what the minimum wage is right now? Current minimum wage? Anybody know? It's a little over $7 an hour. And you know how long it's been that same number? Since 2009 was the last time minimum wage was increased by the federal government. So imagine you work a minimum wage job. You work 40 hours a week, you're gonna work 2,080 hours in a year. You're gonna make not very much money, right? You're gonna make not even $15,000. How can an individual survive on $15,000? You can't. And if you have a family, children that you're trying to raise, you're trying to buy a new car, the average new car price, I just read yesterday, $48,000 is the price of the average new car. And you're trying to get you by all of these electric vehicles, the average price of an electric vehicle, $61,000. Nobody with a minimum wage job can afford that, right? And so we're trying to live off peanuts. And black people were doing really well. Their poverty rate was really, really low in 1970, but today it's really horrible. So across the nation, these policies and practices led to a two-tier system, home ownership. The black home ownership rate, the Federal Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. Part of the reason it passed was because Milwaukee was instrumental in open housing legislation. The open housing marches in Milwaukee, those 200 days of marching in 1967 through 68, really was national news. And a week after Dr. King's assassination, after 2 years of debating, Congress finally passed the Federal Fair Housing Act. And the black home ownership rate has barely budged since then because of discrimination, primarily in lending. And you see the gap between blacks and whites at the end of 2022, nearly 30-point difference. And so when you look here locally, it's even worse. Milwaukee has a distinction of having the second lowest black home ownership rate in the country. If you look at the 50 largest cities, the only city that's worse than Milwaukee is Minneapolis. 25% blacks in Minneapolis homeowners, only 27% Milwaukee. And as you can see, for every group in Milwaukee, the home ownership rates are lower, but significantly lower for blacks and even Latinos in our city versus where they are nationwide. These things are really incredibly important. The last thing I'm going to show you is a video that I did in consultation with the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, talking about what happened when the jobs went away.
So we're here at former Tower Automotive plant, used to be A.O. Smith, and kind of talking about this idea of this perfect storm that hit Milwaukee with the loss of manufacturing jobs, the growth of poverty, and all of the negative components that come along with poverty, and the role that racism has played in that. One of the things that many people in Milwaukee aren't familiar with is how thriving this place used to be. For every American car company for years, and they employed anywhere from 10 to 11,000 people at their peak. But eventually they started to downsize. They were bought up by Tower Automotive, and that deindustrialization that was hitting so many other Rust Belt cities like Pittsburgh and Detroit and Cleveland hit Milwaukee also. And these were the jobs that brought black people to Milwaukee for the most part. These were family supporting wage jobs, but unfortunately the jobs went away. And Milwaukee has never really reinvented itself. It doesn't really know what it is. We know that we used to be, the machine shop of the world, Milwaukee was known as at one time. But now, with all of those jobs gone, people are struggling. The poverty rate has increased, the crime rate has increased, and for most Milwaukeeans, they blame the conditions of the city currently, especially within the African American community, they blame those conditions on the community itself, when they really didn't have much input in terms of what was happening around them. A huge amount of disinvestment that was taking place within the central city that we see here at A.O. Smith and the surrounding neighborhoods, but also just not far from here, the 30th Street corridor, where there were dozens and dozens of small businesses that supported. Those things have a hugely negative impact on the black community in Milwaukee. And so when we think about what the condition is of the community, many people blame the community and say, well, people don't want to work, people are lazy, things of that nature, not knowing that back when all of these manufacturers were still thriving, that people who wanted to work left Mississippi and Arkansas and Georgia and came to Milwaukee to find quality work. But those types of jobs are not as readily available, especially not in the city. And instead of us blaming the community members for the condition, we need to talk about how we can alleviate some of those ills. How can we use some of this money that's coming in for redevelopment and bring some of that into the black community, the central city, because that's what the residents are asking for. Every time I'm out at community events talking about these issues, they always say, listen, there's billions of dollars being spent downtown. What about us? What about our neighborhoods? And to me, the most important aspect of that is bringing jobs back into the city that are family supporting wage jobs. And so I'm hoping that as we move forward as a city, as our elected officials and other public policy makers in the city begin to analyze what's going on, that they begin to be really proactive in reaching out to the community to ask them about solutions and beginning to put policies in place that really lead to us being similar to what we used to be. We'll never be a manufacturing behemoth like we used to be, because those types of jobs are disappearing all over the world. But we can become a thriving community by reinventing Milwaukee and making it something that it wasn't before. And I think that's something that's well needed.
The last thing I want to share with you that wasn't included in the video. In 1970, when you look at people that work in manufacturing facilities, everybody in Milwaukee worked in those factories, right? Blacks, whites, Hispanics, everybody did. However, no community depended on jobs more than blacks. 43% of blacks in Milwaukee that were working in 1970 worked in one of those blue-collar jobs. Only 15% of whites did, so they had many other options. 53% of black men worked in those blue-collar jobs, so when those jobs started to go away, they were hammered. The unemployment rate after the 1981 through 82 recession, which everybody forgets that recession. At that time, that was the largest recession since the Great Depression, and it was exceeded by the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, but it hammered Milwaukee. The unemployment rate went through the roof, and a lot of bad things happened in Milwaukee that we're still trying to recover from. But we're also seeing, the disinvestment in all those years afterwards that are still causing a lot of problems in the city of Milwaukee. And I've said this to our elected officials, and I'll keep saying this until they stop listening to me, that you have to do more for the distressed parts of Milwaukee. You have to make it so that people have opportunities to have access to things that other people in the community take for granted. Access to healthcare facilities, access to grocery stores, access to banks. If you travel around the city of Milwaukee, there are places that are known as food deserts because there's not a grocery store within a mile of them, right? And we're very, very close right now in Milwaukee County to seeing the Milwaukee County transit system go over what they're calling a fiscal cliff, where they're talking about cutting 50% of all the bus routes in Milwaukee County transit system because they're about to run out of money very, very soon. They're fighting to get some funding, but I don't know if they're going to be successful. And most of the people that depend on Milwaukee County transit system for transportation to jobs for black people. So imagine people that are trying to get to jobs, they can't get to work anymore. how much worse that'll make things in the city for everybody. And that's something that we're facing, that it's gonna be really, really ugly unless we get the funding for the county transit system. It's hard enough to get to work, but when the job growth is in the exurban communities out in Waukesha, Milwaukee, Washington counties, how do you get there if you don't have a car? Imagine this. Imagine a person lives in the center of Milwaukee and you have to take public transportation out to a job in Menominee Falls or Waukesha, and you get on the bus and the bus route ends about a mile before you get to where your job is, right? Okay, you're pretty close. In the summer, that's not a bad walk. You walk around in the summer in Milwaukee, no problem. But if it's in January, February, who wants to walk a mile in January, February, Milwaukee to get to their job from the end of that bus route? But that's what a lot of people do on a regular basis. And so there are a lot of challenges Milwaukee has that are directly related to these policies and practices that prevent, equitable housing and still impacting people on a daily basis. I don't think that people think of, housing as something that could negatively impact so many other things, but that's what I've discovered over the course of time. I'm gonna hand the mic over to Dynasty now. She has some things she'd like to share with you all.
I'll do my best to be quick and respect the time. I know we started a bit later today. Hopefully we don't have feedback. All right, so as my colleague Reggie pointed out, the world today is not really different than what we experienced in the past. We often hear people saying things like, segregation that's old terminology. We don't have to talk about that anymore. Racism, we don't experience that problem anymore. But as segregation is still here in the good land, how distant are the effects of the past on neighborhoods that enforce racially restrictive covenants if they still remain predominantly white today? As you saw the maps that Reggie showed you, those communities are still predominantly Black. How far have we come when Black home ownership rates in Milwaukee are 27%, while their white counterparts have home ownership rates of 68.7%. The Good Land, or Milwaukee, was rated the third worst place for Black people to live. Racine was ranked second. We must ask ourselves, who is the land good for, and who owns it? We must ask ourselves, I want to repeat myself, sorry about that. Racism is not a static occurrence. It isn't just something that happens once in history and the people of today are responsible for cleaning up their ancestors' messes. It is something that keeps repeating over time in different forms, affecting generations upon generations of communities of color. My grandmother grew up in Missouri, where she was restricted by segregation from being able to go into her hospital. If she broke an arm or broke a leg, the doctor would have to go out to her home. She was the first in her family to attend a desegregated school as a young person when she became school age. I, on the other hand, was the last person in my family to participate in the Chapter 220 program, which was a school desegregation program here in Milwaukee. I also gave birth to my son in a hospital in a predominantly white community. On the surface, it would appear that we have made great strides. There were once laws, policies, and ordinances in place that segregated our communities, segregating our schools, our restrooms, our movie theaters, our churches, and our restaurants. But when the policies changed, did we stop using the language? Was it gone? We have limited our understanding of change to a physical allowance, assuming that if we change the policy and add people of color to the spaces, that the problem is solved. if we allow Black and brown people to function in spaces alongside their white counterparts, but the experience and the impact of racism and segregation have made little to no shift. Though I was able to give birth in a hospital that was in a predominantly white neighborhood, I shouldn't have had to do that in the first place. I should have been able to give birth right in the community in which I resided in. The evolution of segregation is segregated resources. How many hospitals exist in the heart of Black and brown communities? The evolution of racism and segregation is that a person of color is allowed into the space, but don't often see their face, and don't often feel safe, safe from judgment, safe from prejudice, safe from profiling. When we often think that segregation is a choice, that de facto segregation is in place, but de jure segregation is a culprit. This too has evolved over time, from housing covenants in the early 20s to unfair lending practices throughout the 50s and 60s, to urban renewal, to urban planning, to gentrification, to displacement. These tools have been used to segregate white people from people of color for decades. This is the evolution of racism, thus the evolution of segregation. So our job is not only to clean up the mess that racism made, but to eliminate new mechanisms with old agendas. On the surface, our policies suggest a more just society, as we can no longer use certain language to discriminate against people of color. But that doesn't mean we don't talk about them. We are often in conversations about race by talking about zip code or qualified census tracts. Raise your hand if you know what an underserved community is. Raise your hand if you know what it means to deal with someone who maybe is a part of a community that has at-risk youth. What about food insecurity? Okay, so we're all on the same page. We're still talking about race. We're still talking about communities of color. We're just pretending not to. And this is the practice of racism. The practice of racism is what communities of color experience constantly, and this affects people of color spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. Our faith-based organizations can be the change our nation needs to change this experience as you understand the importance of the whole human. Faith-based organizations are represented in almost every movement, from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., in the civil rights movement to Father Grappi in the fair housing marches here in Milwaukee. But we must start the work within our congregations. First, one of the most segregated places, as Reggie mentioned, to be or to go is to church. They're often dominated by one race, even when their denomination is the same as another demographic's religious affiliation. So I will leave you with saying that it is our responsibility today to acknowledge the history of racism and its presence in the workings of today. It is our responsibility of every generation to keep it from spilling over into the future. For the policies that govern us do not police our individual biases or the biases that unspokenly exist as we navigate through the world. And without these changes, racism and segregation limit our interactions across race. It limits our ability to learn from each other, to grow, and to fulfill our destiny. Not just our individual destiny, but the destiny of the human race.